Eastern Academy of Management. Today's session is on the very important role of ethics in academic careers. My name is Vishal Gupta, and I'm a professor at the University of Alabama. To talk about the importance of ethics in the professional life of PhD students and faculty, we have with us three authors of the 2018 book, The Ethical Professor, Dr. Lorraine Eden from Texas A&M, Dr. Kathy Lund Dean from Gustavus Adolphus College, and Dr. Paul Vaaler from University of Minnesota. Lorraine, Kathy, and Paul, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to join us. In terms of format, we will have a brief presentation from the authors, followed by breakout rooms and Q&A. Given the topic of today's session, I am looking forward to an engaging presentation and the subsequent discussion. With that, over to you, Lorraine, Kathy, and Paul.
Good morning, everyone. I have been elected. I'm Kathy Lund Dean. I have been elected to be the slideshow person. And like Vishal said, we have no interest in lecturing at you. That's not what the book is about. And so we are very keen to hear about some of your issues, some of your experiences. And so there'll be time to have you react to a few scenarios that we have prepared for you, one in research, teaching, and professional life that we'll walk through. And then there'll be some time at the end to revisit some breakout rooms to talk together and just really start the conversation. We don't really have, it's not really normalized to have conversations about some of these issues in the academy. And so the book's main goal was to really bring some transparency to some of these issues that can be very difficult and have implications for your whole career. So we are delighted to be here. We can talk forever about this book. As we get started, before we kind of flip up our first slide, we want to invite you to take just a couple of minutes and jot down something that bothers you from an ethical perspective. It can be in any of the aspects of our work. It could be, again, research, teaching, service, professional life, anything like that, engagement with community, anything that you're doing in your work that you're kind of like, I'm not sure what to do with this, and this makes me a little bit uncomfortable from an ethical perspective. And so if you want to just think about that, and also let us invite you to jot that down as we're talking. If a conversation or the scenario or something in your breakout room triggers a little bit of, oh yeah, that's right, I have had this other experience that this makes me think about, please jot that down. We will again have some time to revisit that at the end. And so I am going to see if share screen works, because, you know, with Zoom, anything can happen. Let me get there. Thank you all for being patient. We're all used to this by now, aren't we? And you can see this. Thank you. Wow, there's lots of things on the screen. Okay, so again, thank you so much for that introduction. And so for the Myers-Briggs S's in the room, here's our brief agenda. And we've talked a little bit about that. And we're going to argue at the back end for a community of practice, but more on that later. And so we have some scenarios for you. There's something on my screen. Thinking about research, teaching, service. And so within the book, it's organized in that way. And there are a variety, it's short little chapters. They're all organized topically around sort of a catalyst situation or a critical incident. And so we'll be talking about ethical issues within the order of authors. Then we'll be talking about students in distress. And then Paul's going to be talking about, in our service and professional life, what do we do with the trolling department head? And so among all of those, some discussion questions to give a little bit of structure there is, can you define what the ethical issue or issues are in that scenario? So what's actually going on there that we need to pay attention to? What about some options for resolving it? What would you do to resolve it and why? And then what do you need help with? You know, navigating ethical issues seems very lonely, seems very isolating, and we want to not do that anymore. How do we build a community around helping us navigate these things? So, and I'm the timekeeper as well. I'm a Myers-Briggs J. Time is meaningful for me. So let's go. And so Lorraine is going to start us out and maybe read through this. That's a lot of words on the screen. But let's start with this one.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm Lorraine Eden, and I'm delighted to be here today. The scenario that we have up on the screen is a fairly common one, I think, that creates an ethical dilemma for us. We all write papers, and most papers are not single authored these days, they're joint authored. And so there's always a perennial issue about order of authors. Now, let me start by saying there are some norms and conventions, and they do vary across the sciences. So a hard science like engineering or a medical science may have a very specific rules on order of authors that's different from the social sciences like political science or management or finance or international business. So I'm going to talk about very much focusing on from the point of view of business faculty in the way we do order of authors. So this little vignette is a case study about 3 PhD students working with their professor, and they submit a paper to a journal, and eventually the paper goes through a variety of rounds of reviews and eventually gets accepted for publication. At the very front, when they started the project, they agreed on order of authors. And as you can see from you read this, the order of authors is in terms of seniority. So the professor's name is first, then there are 2 fourth-year PhD students, and then the last is the first-year PhD student, Alain. Alain, as the project works through, believes that he is doing significantly more work than the other 2 PhD students. He doesn't say anything. And what happens is the paper eventually gets accepted, and he's the caboose, the tail end on the publication. He doesn't say anything to his co-authors, but he actually speaks to another PhD student, probably sharing an office or something with them, and learns that from this other PhD student that the rumor has it on the street that the professor gives more contribution to whoever is on the market. And since the fourth-year ones would be on the market, they were given it basically to highlight them on the market. So I guess the questions are here is there an ethical issue? What are the sort of options that Alain could have done? And throughout the process, what would you have done to resolve it? Have you ever run into a case like this? And what sort of things would you need to help here? And so I'm basically going to open this up. If you want to do something, just raise your hand and unmute yourself. I'll try to recognize people who raise their hand, and feel free to tell me what your sort of thoughts are. What is the ethical dilemma here? Or is there an ethical, do you think? I mean, there may be some people think there is no ethical dilemma and it's all in the head of Alain here. Your thoughts. First hand I have up is Alan Bellison. Please, Alan, unmute yourself. Thanks.
Hi, let's see if I can click on the video. It didn't work before, but this is a common issue. Not only with students, but also among collaborators. It happened to me several times in the past as a major contributor, as a junior faculty and earlier, but it also happened recently with other collaborators. One of the things that journals are doing now that I'm sure that all of us are aware of is providing a disclaimer about the relative contribution of each co-author. And even though the titles appear differently, the contributions suggest who provided heavier load into the research paper. So that's one option that is available. The other option is to follow it alphabetically. Other than that, I think that there is an ethical issue here because there are some interesting angles to this issue here. The professor is hoping to promote the more senior PhD students who are approaching the job market now. And the junior student, the one that ended up contributing more, probably will have more opportunities to learn from the experience. And as Alain, which is a French name, move through the ladder and become more of a senior PhD, then he will have a chance to become a primary contributor. So these are some thoughts that I have on this, but honestly, I can understand his concerns and his issues. I know it happened, once again, to me, it happens also to my kids. All of them are in college, two of them are PhDs, one of them is MDs, and it happened to all three of them. So I'm very familiar with this issue. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Alan. And a couple of quick thoughts. Yes, you're absolutely right. Many journals now are actually asking you to allocate the percent. And I get asked to write letters of reference a lot of times, and often I'll get a letter saying, will you please tell me, you were an author on this paper, and what percent do you think you did? So this is a common response now. I agree. And the idea of simply going by seniority is obviously a common method, and we've all faced this. Let me say I have Samhavi. Please, Samhavi, would you please unmute and tell us your thoughts?
Yeah, I just had a comment on this, not about the ethics of it, but I have seen some papers in which the authors were listed, as columns. So sometimes there were 4 authors and there were 2 columns. So it was not just reading from, left to right. That might be an issue when you give a citation, of course, because of the way that it's cited. But in some of these, it's kind of hard to make out that it seems everyone is equal because they're all listed at the same level.
Right. So the idea of actually having them visually is one possibility, although you're right. When you do the references at the end of a paper, they will be listed in the order of authors that was given. John Bunch, could you unmute, please?
Yeah, I'm going to be somewhat provocative. I think any listing that doesn't reflect percentage of contribution is exploitive and a disservice to grad students and junior faculty. And I see strategies that base order of authorship on seniority or on status of senior faculty versus junior faculty as unethical and unacceptable.
Well, so I'm going to push you a little harder on that. How would you figure out the percentage contribution?
Whoever's doing the most writing, and contributions, if you can't figure it out, should be the sub asterisk should be all of the authors contributed equally.
Okay, so who did the most writing? In other words, the most input
and analysis. Sure.
Okay, all right, and if you can't figure that out, then you would go equal. And then if you go equal, how does that push you? Alphabetical?
I would imagine alphabetically.
Alphabetical. Okay.
I think journals are becoming more sensitive to this.
Mm-hmm. Authors too.
Well, yeah. That has to do with internal reward systems within different universities, which are problematic and a separate issue.
Okay, let me take Paul Jacques now, please.
Hey, what I put in the chat is, to me, how we've worked well is whoever whoever's idea was to begin with. Hey, I've got an idea. We're going to test employee attitudes. We're going to use the model, looking at through the model of the Big Five and theory of planned behavior, something like that. Wow, that's the whole genesis of the paper. So in my head, it is that person's first authorship to lose. And what I mean by lose, if that's the only thing he or she did, came up with the idea and go, hey, y'all, you do it. I came up with a great idea and so I'm all set. No, then they would lose first authorship. But I don't necessarily think of it as a percentage, because the person who does the, say, for example, if an individual does the statistics, an individual does the lit review and it, like whatever, it's not just a matter of time that they put in, like you put in 2 hours, I put in 8, you know, it doesn't work that way. I think it's the value of the contribution that dictates authorship, the holistically stated throughout the paper's project, the value of one's contribution.
Okay, thank you. Other thoughts here? What about, I see in the chat, someone mentions the idea, well, maybe I'll throw this one out. What's the sort of people's view as to who writes the first draft? I've actually seen cases where the argument is he or she who wrote the first draft gets to go first. Or would that be similar, Paul Jacques, to what you think of as the person who has the idea? Or it may be the professor has the idea and someone else writes the first draft. Any thoughts? Oh, I have a hand up here. Anja Fressman, please unmute your mic.
Excuse me just 1 second.
Sure.
This is my time. We have about 1 minute before we need to move on to the next one.
Okay, let me leave it to Anja then, Fressman, please.
So for us, one of the things that are important, who collected the data. So the one who owns the data set has a special role in the research team. And most of the time, no matter how many papers get published, they all are in there who contributed to the data set. So the one who would have the first draft and part of the data set would start as first author, and it could switch depending on the amount of work.
Okay, thank you. I am going to take 1 minute myself, Kathy, of time to talk about what I do, because I think maybe that may be helpful. I've been on a lot of research teams, and I believe the key thing is that up front, when a team gets together, you talk about it. There are norms, and it may be that he who writes the first draft, or he who does the theory behind it, or he who owns the data, but a discussion of the group up front and a willingness to change over time, again, with group discussion, seems to me to be a really helpful thing here. One of the problems is if someone feels it's an unfair and they've been mistreated, they're less likely to stay in the group over time. And if you think about research teams, often they do multiple papers together. And so you want people to feel that it was a good experience and a good contribution. So my own view is transparency. Transparency is really important here, and willingness to change if, suppose you do decide it's based on contribution. And it is true that one person over the whole paper really does end up doing a whole lot more contribution, then they should move up on the project. And at least that's one of my thoughts on how I would think about how to diffuse the issue before we start. In other words, I guess I'm a big believer in ex ante rather than ex post here. So I'm going to turn this over now to the next, back to Kathy to look at the next scenario. Thanks.
Thank you. It's like speed talking, speed analyzing. This is lovely. Thank you. Okay, let's talk about the teaching space. And this might look very different depending on the type of institution you're in. If you've read anything about what's going on, you can imprint your version of student distress, student mental health issues, those kinds of things that so many of us are experiencing. So Samish has been teaching for about 8 years. And one of the things that he likes best is building those relationships with students, being a resource for his students. He's very, very good at mentoring them, helping them, not just in the classroom, building that relational learning space, but all of the other set of things that go along with our job, like letters of recommendation, preparing for interviews, college issues. His students have had major difficulties and struggles during and now beginning to emerge from the pandemic. And as a result of that, he has been inundated with student messages and requests for support. So things like engaging with students in the evenings who just need to talk. And I'm doing a little shout out to my colleague, Regina Bento, who has fielded many of these types of phone calls and can we talk kinds of requests. Students are sharing really difficult things about their lives, financial issues, emotional issues that they're going through. Mental health has deteriorated, and sometimes they're not able to get the professional support and access to resources that they need. And the overlay here too, and this again would vary by institution, Samish's institution really values and cultivates and encourages that type of extra role relationship building with faculty and students, and has encouraged the faculty to be accessible to students in those ways. And so the messaging, I think, is very important in this kind of a scenario. He wants to support students as much as possible, but his own burnout and his own need for boundaries and energy are being threatened, and he doesn't know what else he's going to do. He knows he can't keep it up much longer. And so perhaps some of this resonates with you. Perhaps you've had some issues with students really reaching out in ways they haven't before. And you're being called on to support students in these really multimodal and very deep ways. And maybe, again, the messaging or not in your institution is that, yeah, that's a good thing for you. So let's talk through it. And I will facilitate much like Lorraine did. So what are people experiencing, and what seems difficult ethically in this scenario as you see it? I have not looked in the chat. Maybe Paul or Lorraine, you can.
I have the chat open.
Thank you. Anyone want to talk? Mariana. Oh, hi, Mariana.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you for doing this. I relate to so many of these situations, so I appreciate how current you're making all of this. There's so many issues involved. I definitely think there is some ethical issues here. I know there's so many layers to this one scenario in terms of the students, what the issues are, you know, the kind of subject matter you teach. I know I'm a leadership professor, and so we teach about empowering voices, right, and empowering the voice. I'm also a faculty of color, right? So in the pandemic, I had a lot of students reaching out to me for all kinds of issues. And I agree. I don't know who, somebody wrote something about therapy in the chat. I think that was really important. I know sometimes as faculty, we're expected almost to be in this therapeutic role, which I don't want to play. I mean, and so I think as professors, we oftentimes reach out to the mental health professionals to help us. The problem is when they don't, right? When they actually expect us to continue in these roles, only increasing the burnout. And so I think, honestly, one of the questions for universities about ethics is how it's valued. What is value? And so I think, you know, pre-pandemic, we would say these things are valued and maybe there were some resources provided. But I think as the pandemic has gone on, there's increased accountability for universities about numbers of people being enrolled, right? Credit hours, citation counts. And so universities, I don't think are putting the resources towards this kind of time that faculty are putting into helping students, which is only increasing burnout. So if faculty have to continue to do this without having resources towards research and other things, it's really almost hypocritical, right, about what value is. So I think resources go where value is. And I think that's probably one of my questions in this scenario is how is value really rewarded?
Yeah, and thank you for bringing in the aspect of being a faculty member of color. I sit on our promotion and tenure committee, and thinking about what counts in terms of service and engagement with students, and faculty of color get multiplicatively more mentoring requests, distress calls, and we have to find ways of valuing that in terms of formal structures. And I saw in the chat too, so there's one piece of it. I saw in the chat that one of the ethical issues here is, how are we qualified? You know, where is that line between being an ear and being a sounding board and dispensing advice and making recommendations for next steps in terms of mental health? Where does that end? We are not clinicians. Most of us are not clinicians, and students are not in the place sometimes to understand where those lines are. They just know they need help, and they just know they trust you, and they have a relationship with you. You may be that person on campus they trust the most. And so where is that line, and how do we set those boundaries responsibly? Yeah, so thank you for that. I'm conscious too of our time. I want to make sure Paul gets that. Thanks, Mariana, for that. It's good to see you. And if there's no other raised hand, and we'll have time to talk through some of these together, let's move to the professional life and our trolling department head. And Paul, let me send this over to you.
Great, thank you, Kathy, and thanks so much for all of you for being here today. I'd like to say that Lorraine and Kathy have it easy. They've got really well-defined areas. Service is like the department of everything else in our lives, and it can be so many different things when we think about how we relate to our departments, our colleges, our universities, to our communities, to our various academic professional associations, to our families. All those are part of it. And so I think this is really such a wide-ranging area, and this vignette is really touching on just one small part of it, but I think it's one that's helpful for us to think about the ethical issues about it. And so if you look through this, this is probably a pretty typical situation that we face when we're in our offices or we're available other means digitally, and our colleagues who are in positions of a supervisory authority as a department comes in to see you and has, you know, asks those three words, got a minute? And when that happens, and we say yes, then within 20 minutes or 30 minutes, suddenly we're on a committee within the department or in the college or in the university. It's part of our job. And I think that that's something that we all face every day. And I think for me, at least, when we think about that double knock and that question, got a minute, we think about who that person is in the office. And for many of us here who've been in the business for years or decades and are sitting with some, you know, with tenure and the like, there's a way for us to respond to that. But for so many more of us, and I think all of us in our career, we've had a moment where we haven't had that kind of same situation, where we've been, maybe we're a doctoral student or we're a young assistant professor building our career. And I think I want us to maybe keep that person in mind as we think about what the potential ethical issue is when a department chair or an associate dean comes in and asks us to contribute to the service life, the very important service life in our department, in our college, and our university. It's something that's important for us. And I wonder if maybe all of us who've had that experience have some feedback, have some thoughts about what are the issues, if any, that come up. What's our intuition about that? Let me stop there and see if we have some raised hands or some commentary from others. Maybe Lorraine and Kathy, you can also take a look and see this as we go along.
I'll just jump in really quickly because I can't not. And I'll wait. If there's a hand, I will promptly shut up. What I think is very interesting about this, and it varies among institutions and norms, is that the work of running the institution has demonstrably gotten more and more complex. Mm-hmm. And the roles that are available, because tenure or senior roles are decreasing, it's more work distributed among fewer people, and that trajectory is not going to change. And so I see that as one of the major issues here. And Paul, you've got two raised hands here.
Right, maybe Sambi and then John, your comments on the scenario?
Hi, so I want to say that I had been, as an untenured assistant professor, put on so many committees, And some of them, a lot of them, I actually thought was good because it gave me visibility across the college, and I learned a lot of things about how the college functions, curriculum committees, core curriculum, mentoring, etc. The problem committees that I was put on were some hiring committees in which, I was expected to just be a check, just sign along. And that was very problematic for me. And I didn't know how to negotiate it. I asked my chair. She just said, oh, the head of the committee, he's like a good guy, whatever. But if I was not untenured, I wouldn't have done it.
Right. So it's the issue about how do you respond when it maybe not the first time that's asked, but the nth time that that's asked to be a part of a committee and to do that service. We all know it's important.
Yep.
The question is how much and how do we respond when we think we're getting that edge? John, what are your thoughts? If you can unmute, John, I apologize.
Yeah. I'm the co-chair of our college DEI committee, and one of the issues has come up, and it's a significant one. It's that women are more likely to accept and be seen as willing to engage in service activity. And I think it's incumbent on the folks that are meting out these different roles and responsibilities to take balanced allocations of duties very, very seriously, because I look around our college and we know about the issue, and then we see, most of the major service activities in the college being headed by women professors, and the guys not as visible. And I think that's problematic.
I really appreciate bringing that up, John, that the first comment from Samavi was about thinking about these issues from the standpoint of the person in the office, the professor who gets asked. And you brought up the other side of this. It's a two-way negotiation. It's about the department chair and what she or he does to decide how, whom, and how to approach that person, and taking into account their background and their own load. Other comments on that as well? Well, I was going to say, because I think we want to make sure that you have time to raise the issues that go with the situations you face, not just the ones that we pick out. But let me just point out that there's some commonalities that I see with the three scenarios here, and you've raised them. And I think the first one across research, teaching, and service is that there are implicit or sometimes explicit power relationships that are there. When we're negotiating author order, when we're examining issues about teaching and how to respond to needful students, when we're dealing with service and relationships, there are issues about rank, there are issues about authority and power, and I think it's being aware and being explicit about those that's so important. Usually these are two-way decisions. Even in the teaching issue that Kathy mentioned, I think there's a missing authority there. There's a dean or an associate dean or some other administrator who can run interference and help you with those issues when students are coming at you with your less than perfect expertise in that area, and certainly your limited time. And then I think the other issue is about how so much of this is very context specific. The research orientation and order author is really, it's a team production problem. The group itself will know the best. And as Lorraine said, if it isn't equitable, then that group isn't going to last together very long. And I think it's the same thing with service. In many ways, the department chair who pushes the assistant professor around too far finds that they're not department chair for that long, because that's usually something where the rest of the faculty can figure that out. There's a reason we call us colleagues. So I think there are many different issues about how that are context specific, but are about power specific as well. And as we understand and are explicit about those, I think that we make those issues clearer, and maybe we make those issues easier to at least address, if not solve. Let me stop there and send it back to you, Kathy.
Thank you. Super. So it took, I was just reading the chat, sorry, like modality switch here. It takes very little time to both relate to what these issues are and think about, what is going on here. And the power dynamic is that through story that seems to underlie so much of what we're doing, and where most of the problematic issues or many of the problematic issues are coming. So does anyone want to share a little bit about what they talked about?
So I can tell you, Kathy, some of the things that came up in ours. Just a quick list. We ended up with several examples. One was weekend burnout, where basically faculty feel they're on all the time and they never get off. The second is, what do you do if you have your department head or dean come to you and ask you to redo the syllabus after it's been published and make adjustments either for some of your students or all of your students. You're basically changing the weight around and stuff. The issue was during COVID, but more generally here. Third was the issue of order of authors. A lot of discussion about the different kinds of norms and ways you could order authors here. Another one we discussed was who needs it? Well, that would be order of authors too. The other one was in people talking about service, the same thing about someone coming in very new when they were an assistant professor and asking them to do service. And then the last one was, what do you do when people come and ask you for exceptions? They want to be treated differently from the others for some reason. So those are the ones that came up in my group. So they were across all the range.
Yeah, let me add, Kathy, we talked about two things about, not surprisingly, related to the pandemic, due dates and distress, student distress, and dealing with, sometimes we try to make them hard constraints, but they get softer in that context of a public health crisis. And then ones that I think aren't about the pandemic, grade inflation, and how we try and do our best to assess when we also know that there's a feedback mechanism in the way that we're assessed for the effectiveness in the classroom, and the two are related. So we talked about those issues. And then as it happened, we had I've just seen now in the chat from some of our participants, also the usual issues that are tied often to us when we're in a place, the world of politics. A university is a place for discussion. And so partisan politics sometimes works its way into the business school, and as it does the university more generally. So how we try to have those discussions when they're relevant to what we do in the classroom, and how we do them in a respectful way.
Thank you. We had some very interesting conversations as well about, what happens, how should you think about choosing co-authors, and how cautious should you be about sharing ideas with people who may or may not want to include you later on, and some issues. We didn't get a chance to fully explore some of the difficulties between online and face-to-face, and some of the habits and some of the trends that we're seeing in terms of student engagement, willingness to go deeply into the content, and where some of those lines are. And yeah, it's so I'm again conscious of our time. Thank you everybody for such great conversation. I'm going to share screen one more time and just share a little bit about what the book can maybe engage you with. And so we're talking really about a community of practice, and it seems pretty clear that there is energy around wanting to talk about all of these issues in community. And we, again, we don't have many ways of doing that except informally, and things like this. We appreciated Vishal's invitation. And so really moving ahead toward a community of practice where having these conversations in a trust-based environment can be normalized. So, and I see from one of the themes that we talked about in particular, the research one is the transparency. If you're feeling things are unfair, if you're feeling things have changed from your initial kind of determination of author order, or anything that you seem to have an agreement and the goalposts have shifted, how do you have a conversation about that? And how do you bring that to the light and be transparent? And also being very consistent with your behavior and expectations. Thinking about how consistency and transparency builds reputation as a professional currency. We talk a lot about that in the book, and ways of building that currency as a professional member of the academy. And the other thing that we talked about is sharing some of these analytic frameworks. And you don't have to do this alone, or you don't have to kind of do it in free form. Just one of those types of analytic frameworks by which to think through some of these complicated issues comes from Badaracco. We have other ones in the book, so choosing one that seems to work for you is okay. So thinking about the net, meaning consequences now, and then as they move out in other communities. So consequences for me, consequences for other people. what must I do? What are my obligations in the role that I'm taking? And we heard some of that. You know, if you're a PhD supervisor, if you're the instructor, if you're the department chair, what are those core obligations? And having some clarity around role-based obligations is very helpful. What will work in the world as it is? So we have aspirational kinds of solutions, and what can we actually do? Who are we as cultural and identity based? And then what can I live with is, you know, what's the satisfied solution here, and can I live with that? And so this is, again, just one of those types of analytic frameworks. And we leave you with a little bit of a joke, a little bit of Calvin and Hobbes, who's one of our very favorites, and comments and questions. We would love to entertain them. And thank you very much. Vishal, you've got 2 minutes. We are delighted. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Thanks, Lorraine and Paul, for the wonderful session. You guys really made it interactive, which is what we've been trying in these learn and share sessions, but have been very difficult so far. And I'm so glad you made it very interactive. Now, let me say a couple of things. First is, I would highly recommend people to read the book that Kathy, Lorraine, and Paul wrote. I read the book and I found myself using something from the book to discuss with my department chair on the very interesting issue of, does someone who only contributes a data set to a research paper deserves authorship or not? And I took something from the book, and I'll tell you what, there was an interview with Mike Hitt in the book. And I took that to my department chair, and we sat across the table and we discussed it. And, you know, there was, like with many things, there are nuances to it, but reading the book sort of gets you to the first step of having that discussion in an informed manner. So I would, you know, strongly recommend people reading the book. I would also echo what Kathy said, which is, you don't have to do it alone. We are in a community of scholars, and anytime you find yourself dealing with what you think is an ethical dilemma, there is no shame, no embarrassment, no harm in reaching out to senior faculty who you respect, who have a reputation for being highly ethical. Even maybe Paul, Kathy, Lorraine, if they agree to sort of you reaching out to them for advice. And, you know, there is no centralized mechanism in our profession to deal with these ethical issues. So I would strongly sort of recommend reaching out to senior faculty, including experts like Paul, Kathy, and Lorraine. And the last thing I'll say is, I fully agree with what Kathy said about reputation. In this profession, the thing that will go with you everywhere and forever is your reputation. And you want your reputation to be one of someone who behaves at the highest level of ethics. There is no room, in my view, in this profession in terms of compromising on that. On that note, again, thank you, Lorraine, thank you, Paul, and thank you, Kathy, for your time today.
This was completely self-indulgent for us. We absolutely love it. Thank you so much for your conversation and your frank comments and in the chat. Thank you so much to the Eastern Academy.
Thank you also. I really enjoyed the opportunity to get together with my co-authors and with everyone to talk about issues that we think are fundamental for the health of the Academy and going forward.
Very
Best
well
wishes
put.
for the rest of the meeting. Enjoy that. Cheers.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
And see you all in the next forum somewhere.
And I think the slide deck is available, right? And I believe the slide deck's available for those of you who would like a copy.
Yeah, and we'll make the presentation.
It's recorded. Yeah, that'll be great.
That'd be great. Thanks so
Thank
much.
you. Bye.
Bye.
So much.